welcome back. We're going to discuss this book, which is called The Fourth Turning, and I have my great friend and scholar Mike McCulloch of Plymouth University. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, Mike, this book is actually your suggestion. In a sense, you introduced it to me, so I was aware of this book in graduate school when I was discouraged from reading it for some reasons we can go into. So there's systemic reasons such as the opposition to cyclical theories of history, which is kind of a progressive ideological position that history is linear, away from the horrible things of the past to the utopia that progressives promise. So they don't like cyclical views of history. This has a cyclical view of history, which explains the title here. The fourth turning is the fourth period in a 80-year cycle of events. We're going to have to explain this. Now, this book was written in 1997. This is actually the 1997 edition. And what it impresses me is that this is so relevant. I've marked lots of places in the text which could be written today about the social revolution, the triumph of individualism, selfish individualism rather than self-actualized individualism. Lots of things in here. I think I'll just sum this up. This is a forecast of what was to come in the next 20 years, up to actually around this year, 2020 to 2025. We're speaking of 2021, and very prescient. It's more impressive reading it in 2021 than it was in 1997, because its forecasts have largely come true. There's a sort of lack of specificity in some of them, which we should discuss. But it's actually more impressive to read this year than it was in 1997. So I should add, there's a history-based theory about how events cycle on a generational basis, on the human generational basis. There's lots of politics and society and economics, and it's a profound book. And I think actually I should add, it can be an intimidating read because it's so dense in the history and so interpretive, so rich, and also challenging in its capacity to forecast, which academics don't like to do anymore. I think it's quite a challenging read, but one that is very rewarding. So there's risk reward in this book. Anyway, trying to be brief. That was me trying to summarize this book. How would you summarize it?
Well, as a physicist, a scientist, what excited me most about it was that it's the first time I've really seen history try to become predictive. It's obviously not the first example of that, but it's perhaps the boldest attempt I've seen. So for physicists, that's great, because it brings history within the realm of mathematics and prediction.
Yeah.
So it really excited me a lot because of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that as a physicist, this appeals to you more than it would in the social sciences and the humanities, which truly is its domain. So this is history-based theory about particularly political and social cycles. So it belongs in the humanities and social sciences, probably more the humanities than the social sciences, and yet it's a very unpopular book. I mean, it's practically cancelled in the humanities, social sciences, because
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, so I was in grad school. I actually started grad school in the year that this was published, and we were discouraged from reading any cyclical theories of anything. I mean, so some of the excuses for that were had some sort of empirical merit. So I remember one of my professors said, you cannot have time as a variable. and cycles use time as a variable. So they're saying the longer you go in this particular period of time, the more you predict certain events that would take you back to that cycle. So the objection there was that time cannot be a variable. However, time is a variable in all sorts of domains, such as biological life cycles. So, and it's one of the points that the book makes, that human beings live a biological life cycle, and that life cycle is going to have an impact on the way they live their lives, and thence on generational experiences, and then on how generations end. So that our innate life cycle has an effect on our overall social and political cycles too. So I didn't accept that, but I think there's a lot of political cover going on here. When people say you cannot have time as a variable, I think it's cover for people saying we don't like the politics of the book. The book.
Yes, that doesn't make any sense to me, that the time cannot be a variable, because in physics it always is a variable, and a very important one.
Yeah, and we should mention that this book does do a good job of admitting its inspirations. There is a long tradition of using cycles to explain history, and even in political science. So Quincy Wright is quoted here. So Quincy Wright is studied because of his very empirically well-regarded studies of the causes of war and the processes of war. And yet his cyclical theory is not studied. It's sort of not even admitted. Toynbee, Rosecrans, Wallerstein, Medelsky, Thompson, who have they have a power transition theory, which is usually taught without time as a variable. So power transition being, you get hegemons, political hegemons arising, and eventually they must fall. There's a cycle to this. So even where these theorists are admitted, they're not taught with the cyclical part of their theory admitted. It sort of drops out. So this book is, I think, a refreshing read for anybody who has been denied has been denied what could we say? Denied the conceptual or theoretical possibility that human factors, human variables also have a cyclical quality to them, not just non-human animals or physical, inanimate physical objects like cosmoses and stars and all the rest of it.
Yes, I think it's informational as well, because a person is born and has certain experiences, and then the information that they accrue dies with them, and this theory nicely brings that into history.
Yeah. So we should talk about this. It's forecast. So there's a subtitle here, which is sort of somewhat hidden. I'm trying to show you the cover. The subtitle here is An American Prophecy. Here we go. An American Prophecy. I should say this. It's very American in its popular cultural examples, but when it grounds itself as American, it's actually grounding itself much earlier in what it calls an Anglo-American long-term history. So the American founding has an Anglo background to it, and thence the historical cycles that the book documents, they actually go back to the Elizabethan era. So there's
the Battle of Bosworth Field, 1485, the Battle of Bosworth Field. It's very interesting that it suggests that history is, well, Anglo-Saxon American history is like a wave that was begun at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and that has a period of about 80 years. Yeah.
So the other part of this subtitle is the word prophecy. And I was indicating earlier how the book actually becomes more impressive in time because its prophecies turn out well. this is not a book discredited by the history since it was published. It predicts a lot of what we're experiencing as a woke crisis, as a cultural war. So the book actually predicts a culture war. Actually, it grounds that culture war in the 1990s. There's maybe more to say about this. The book actually theorizes that you always get a cultural war. They call it a crisis. So at the end of this 80-year cycle, you'll always get a crisis. And we should point out the crisis can go either negative or positive ways. So a cultural crisis could be justified in terms of there are things that have become settled which are not right, and we need a sort of cultural revolution to turn those things over. So the book talks a lot about generational tensions, where younger generations, they see problems with the institutions that their older generations have set up, and there is justification in changing those, and there's a struggle about change. That would be the positive interpretation of a crisis. And yet there's a negative possibility here where the cultural crisis goes the wrong way and it's just destructive, and it tears down things that have value and virtue. And that seems to me we're living at the particular crisis we're living through in our particular generational cycle is a very negative one. Too much, whereas maybe 30 years ago, a lot of what was targeted may have been justified, such as institutionalized racism, so far as it existed. Now the targets are not justifiable. People are targeting family structures and law enforcement, the rule of law, non-violent political discourse. These are the things they are targeting, and it seems that we're in danger of a crisis not resolving anything but making the world worse for the next generation.
I think what tends to happen in these crises, my interpretation of it, is that society splits up. The debate can no longer go on. So society splits up into two groups who then basically fight it out. So that is, it seems, that is now what is happening. That, if you like, the woke side of society with their ideas and the base side are splitting up, and some sort of resolution will come from that. Rather like the Civil War in America, which was between two different ideals. Even the Second World War, you can look at it that way, between the Anglo-Saxon liberalism and fascism on the other side.
Yeah, yeah. I've got a question for you about that, because part of the difficulty about reading this book is when do you actually date a crisis? Because we've lived the generational cycle that we're currently coming to the end of, according to this book, has gone through 2 world wars that were actually not crises within this generational cycle. We're living through the culminating crisis of the generational cycle now, rather than 1940s or the 1910s, which is a little difficult to get your head around. I just want to give one quote. This is actually from page 7. So remember, this book is written in 1997. The quote here is, by the 2020s, America, read America as the West pretty much, America could become a society that is good by today's standards and also one that works. So that was the positive hope for the end of crisis in the 2020s, that whatever changes are revolutionized, pushed into being by this tension between the two sides of the crisis, the outcomes would be good. But there is a warning here elsewhere in the book that well, actually I can give you a good quote from the same page. History's howling storms can bring out the worst and best in society. So we're not guaranteed to produce the best in ourselves from a crisis. We could produce the worst in ourselves. So I suppose I'm still confused, and I think the book is deliberately ambiguous on this. I'm still confused about how far we can predict the outcome of a crisis. when I'm reading the book, it's almost like the outcome is very situation dependent, and there is no guarantee that any crisis will have good outcomes.
It's interesting because given the society we now live in, where we are now, all the previous crises turn out to have been an advance towards the particular point we find ourselves in. That may not have seemed so to the people who are going through the crisis. Half of them may have thought that the wrong decision was made. But in hindsight, you could say that everyone has worked, but that's only from our particular point of view, because we naturally assume that our society is a good one.
Yeah, let's try to pin down their forecast of what they called their prophecy. I actually don't like the word prophecy because it makes the book sound like it's millenarian or religious, and it's not. It's historically founded. There's another quote here from page 299 where they're sort of concluding their prospects. If the crisis catalyst comes on schedule around the year 2005, meaning the beginning of the crisis period, 2005, then the climax will be due around 2020, the resolution around 2026. This isn't the only point where they make this dating, but the dating is difficult for me to process because it's an awfully long period to call a crisis. 21 years, a 21-year crisis.
It's one generation, isn't it? The idea is it's one generation, so
yeah.
Approximately 22 years. But I date the crisis to 2008. I'm not sure about it, but I take as my clue one of their statements where they said that at the beginning of the crisis, birth rates always collapse. Yeah, so I date it from 2008 from the crash, the financial crash.
Yeah, and actually, I'm trying to find the page where they actually predict a financial crash as one of the potential scenarios which would,
yes, they do. Yeah.
Which would exemplify the beginning of the crisis. So they have. So I'm gonna give you page 277. I don't think this is the only page where they try to set out these potential scenarios. So 277, they talk about economic distress, public debt, bankruptcy, poverty, unemployment, trade wars, collapsing financial markets. Yeah, 2008 economic crisis could fit that. Then there's social distress, quote, with violence fueled by class, race, nativism, or religion, and abetted by armed gangs, underground militias, and mercenaries hired by walled communities. That sounds a lot like 2020.
Yes,
the breakdown of law and order, fueled, quote, fueled by class, race, nativism, religion, where we count wokeness as a religion, as many people do. There's cultural distress, technological distress, ecological distress, political distress, quote, with institutional collapse. Yeah, we've seen that. Governments abrogating their responsibilities for law and order, for instance. Military distress. I'm a political scientist who focuses a lot on international conflict. So I have a bias to thinking that crises are wars, which I think that's a problem in my own analysis. So that refers back to me thinking, the world wars should be the crises. Why weren't they the crises? Why did we have to wait until 2008, 2005? But they do forecast, one of the scenarios could be a mass casualty terrorist event. So maybe 2001, 9/11 would be the beginning.
Yes, I considered that cycle too. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you think about the timing of all this, how do you shake it out? Because to repeat, talking about a 21-year crisis period, it's not even a cycle. This is the end of the cycle. It's a period that lasts 21 years. That's problematic because so much happens in 21 years. You have wars, economic crises, you have all sorts of different crises within a 21-year period. It then becomes difficult to keep such a long period as 21 years contiguous as the particular crisis of our generation.
Yes, well, I think it's wrong to say that they they can necessarily predict the exact year it's going to happen. But the crisis is caused because people who have never experienced war are now in charge. So these are the archetype called the prophet archetype, who were born after the Second World War, and they have now achieved ultimate power because they're in elderhood. So they're in control of everything, and they are pursuing their ideals, and that's causing a lot of problems.
There's some quite complex interaction effects between these different generations. So there's a quote here on 275, just so you know, I'm looking. The quote here: the unraveling era culture warriors. So the unraveling generation is the generation that is born in the third turning, or comes of age in the third turning, and that's sort of our generation, I think. 1970s, 1980s, coming of age.
Yes, I think we would be nomads. I mean, I'm not assuming when you were born, but I've pinpointed myself as a nomad, born in the awakening. And the thing about the nomads is that they were born in a time when their parents were off discovering themselves. And it wasn't true in my case, but I'm talking statistically, the statistical average. And so what they're searching for, not theories, but realism. So they're quite grounded people, whereas prophets are the exact opposite. They're very idealistic.
Yeah, the interaction effects are quite complex, so it can be confusing to read, where the generation is not necessarily defined by where it's born, but its formative period, or when it comes of age, or when it takes power. So it's for nomads are kind of the victims of history. They're not coincident with their opportunities to be heroes. They don't have the power to, they don't come of age at the right time to have the power to make sure that things go right. They're sort of victims of each stage.
Well, you say that, but apparently they have more fun than everybody else, because they get their prime of life doing an unraveling. So a very diverse time where there's a lot of opportunity to have fun and be an individual and do what you want. But they have a very...
But for our particular nomad generation, so we should point out that nomads are not particular to the 20th century. So under this cyclical theory, there's a nomad generation once every 80 years, and so nomads have there've been nomads having similar experiences to us as nomads, coincident nomads before. But when I think about the good times that nomads had, I mean, the period of individualism and heady opportunities, that was pretty short for nomads. It's essentially the 1980s. So you had the 1970s, which were pretty dire economically and fairly revolutionary still. So it wasn't as bad as the 1960s, but there's a lot of carryover from the 1960s. So 1970s are pretty dire, and then 1980s, lots of restoration of freedoms, economic opportunities, and then you get the 1990s. So there's an economic crash, and there's and eventually there's terrorism, and so for us as nomads, I think like I say, we're victims of history. We have one good decade, and then it's downhill from there.
Well, maybe more than one good decade, because you could look at times now. I mean, we are now extremely limited in what we can do already, because we've passed the unraveling. We're in a crisis, middle of a crisis.
Yeah.
So we can look back on the 90s and the 00s as pretty good times, really, compared to what we have now.
Well, I think, yeah, but you're being generous there. You're saying the unraveling is good relative to how bad it is now. So it's like unraveling is not a great, it's not of the 4 turnings in a generational cycle, the unraveling's not a great turning. It's just better than the worst of the turnings, which is the crisis.
Yes, I suppose so. The thing to look forward to, I suppose, is the high that comes after the crisis, because after everything's been resolved, society's split in two, fought it out and decided which way to go. Everybody can move forward together. So we get back into a period like the 1950s, where people appear extremely happy and contented with what they had. But these are also periods when certain things are banned, and there's very little, I don't know, very little curiosity in them.
Yeah, don't forget, you get the 1950s, you get the stability, the prosperity, and resolution of the 1950s if the crisis goes the right way, if it goes the right way. So it could go the wrong way.
Yes.
And then everything is torn down. You don't go back to the 1950s. You got something new and ugly, which will have to be resolved with a whole new crisis. So we're not guaranteed to resolve this in a 1950s type way.
That's true. Yeah.
I mean, I think just to go back to my earlier point, with nomads, we're still the victims of history, because you're saying we can look forward to the high, but we'll be too old to really enjoy the high. You know, that'll be the final 20 years of our lives.
And also, the character of the nomad is not to ask for more as well. So we have a crucial role in history, in that we have to. I think I've got a quote somewhere. I don't know which page it was, but close to the end, it says that 13ers, so that's his name, their name for the nomads of our current generation, must keep boomers from wreaking needless destruction. Yeah. And they must also stop the millennials from marching too mindlessly for the profits for the boomers. So we have a crucial role to ground, to make decisions careful and realistic.
Yeah, we do, but that's the curse of the nomads. I think the nomads are cursed here because they have an important role in history, but the benefits of that role are largely for previous and subsequent generations. The nomads themselves, they're just born at the wrong time, so they're between the high, and they're going to end their lives in a high. They have a crucial, they have to do a lot of the hard work to make sure that high comes back in a positive way, but they don't really get to enjoy it. So the nomads, I think of the nomads as the worst. They're the unluckiest of the 4 generations in the cycle. The heroes are probably the best off.
Yes, I think that's probably true. Yeah.
I mean, so if we can turn back to some of the rather what's the right word, surprising prophecies, as they call them, they do predict, as I was saying earlier, they do predict culture wars. And I got a quote on page 300 how they foresee these culture wars. They say, so the question they pose here: what present day tensions will the next 4th turning resolve? Right, remember they're writing in 1997, looking forward to the 2020s. Most likely there will be culture wars, updates of the perennial struggle between the individual and the collective, with new labels dating back to our recent consciousness revolution. I find this very predictive. What do you think?
Yes, so our culture war is happening now, and it's, as we said, between the woke side of society and the what you might call the based side of society. And I think what this means is that the woke people believe that you should be judged. I'm sure they would not say it this way, but you should be judged by accidents of birth. So, for example, if you're black, you automatically assume that you're a victim and you get certain advantages. Whereas the based side of society, and I may be biased, but I think this is the side that has to win, says that people have to be judged by what they do in life, by their actions. And I think that is harking actually back to the religious attitude, which the practical aspect of religion is that you were judged by your actions. It was by God, of course, but people believed in God back then. So the based attitude is quite a healthy one and has a long pedigree. And I think this battle between the woke and the based sides is now becoming crucial.
Yeah, I think there's also an implicit, I mean, there's several types of culture war implicit in how they talk about culture wars. In that particular quote, they talk about a battle between the individual and the collective. There's many ways you can interpret that could be the individual in a liberal sense, so the autonomous individual, the self-actualized individual, in a battle with big government, which wants to control. So this is a battle between classical liberals and progressives. Progressives want to do things for you. Liberals, classical liberals, want to have the freedom to do things for themselves. That's one battle. But there's also a battle they've talked about several times in other contexts between the selfish and the communitarian, as in the individual, the selfish individual emerges in the unraveling, and in fact, it begins in the 1960s for our generation, where it's all about the self, and even at the expense of the community, and the community. A lot of the rhetoric of the selfish is community oriented. So a lot of the rhetoric of progressivism is about a better society as a whole. But of course, progressives in their new woke form, they're destroying certain sectors of societies for the privileging of others. So in the name of countering privilege, they will privilege certain sectors of societies at the cost of other sectors of society, and moreover, they're doing so in a hypocritical way. They're saying this is for the good of all, and they're denying that actually what they're doing is not for the good of all. You're just reversing privileges. So they're going to be fashionable groups and demonized groups, and you're justifying flipping those around because of exaggerated historical perspectives on who was privileged or who is. And the cost of all that is meritocracy, as you indicated earlier. What falls institutionally or politically, what falls out of this cycle is then meritocracy. And I think that's another war in the culture wars between merit and demographic privilege, that we no longer choose people on merit, we privilege them on race, or we demonize people on race or gender as appropriate to the fashions, and meritocracy falls out. And this book is very keen on meritocracy. It's quite a conservative book. It's very pro-Western, and it identifies meritocracy as one of the virtues necessary to the West's success.
Yes, we need it to go on, to survive. This does remind me very much of the Civil War, actually, because in the Civil War they had a situation that was not economically efficient, because in the South there were black slaves, and they were not able to compete on the same economic level with whites. So it was a bad system, and that was rectified. And at the moment we have a similar system where blacks are now to be treated differently, and that is also economically inefficient. So it's my view that society will correct that in a similar way.
Yeah, and you're saying that in an optimistic way. So society will correct that.
So people will be judged by what they do rather than whether they're black or white, but they will be judged fairly.
So your aspirations for race relations are more Martin Luther King than Joe Biden. Yeah. Right.
Yes, that's right. Colorblind.
Yeah. Judge people by the content of their characters and not by their color. Right. But so you're optimistic, I suppose. I don't think I'm as optimistic as you, and that's partly because I was optimistic years ago, and things just keep getting worse beyond what I think of as the turning point. I keep thinking, well, surely people realize that we got to reverse this process, and we don't reverse it. So I think I'm more pessimistic than you. I mean, what can you unpack where your optimism comes from? Why are you confident that this will correct in the right way?
Well, don't misunderstand me. I think things are going to get very bad. I mean, effectively, debate has been silenced, and so, as I said, society is now splitting into two bits, which will then start to fight. So it will get very bad. But every fourth turning in history has turned out well from our point of view so far. So
yeah, okay. So I don't disagree with you. I'm just going to give you a quote here from the book where the authors sort of hedge the bets. This is one of the problems with historical forecasts, is that forecasters will say this could happen, but on the other hand, and then then it becomes unfalsifiable, right? So that they predict it both towards both extremes, and whichever one happens, they can say, well, I sort of allowed for that, and then it's unfalsifiable. But you reminded me of the pessimistic version of their forecast. I'm going to read you this. This is from 299. Quote, as many Americans know from their own ancestral backgrounds, history provides numerous examples of societies that have been wiped off the map, ground into submission, or beaten so badly they revert to barbarism. So I think that's the potential negative outcome of this crisis that we're living through. The Western society as we know it, merit, colorblindness, liberty, individual liberty, classical liberty, economic freedoms, political representation, checks and balances, those things could be, quote, wiped off the map, ground into submission.
yes, well, they could, but we have 6 examples in the past where they haven't, where people have worked out how to get through without destroying everything. The difference this time is that we have nuclear weapons. The big danger of the crisis that I see is that wars are fought with fury in a crisis. They don't hold back. It's a kind of attitude that the prophet generation has, it seems. But would that happen now we have nuclear weapons? Would that be allowed to happen?
By the way, when you say profit generation, do you need profit P-H-E-T, or do you mean F-I-T, profit?
PH, the visionaries, the ones who were born after the crisis, the last crisis.
Yeah. So yeah, the profits, right? So I suppose I should ask you too. Earlier you said there's going to be two sides. So I think we're already in this polarization. There are only two sides, and if there is a sort of third party here, they're neutrals, and I think they're incredibly naive not to have picked a side yet. You can't be neutral in this current woke, anti-woke culture war, because liberty is at stake. But you said earlier there's two sides. I agree with that. Then you said they've got to fight. Now, when you say fight, what sort of fight do you mean?
Well, in the past, it's always involved warfare. So it's either been a civil war or an international conflict. Now, of course, this time could be different, but we've had 6 examples of this so far.
Yeah, so I indicated earlier, I as a political scientist who studies war a lot, I have a natural bias to think of crisis as war, and the book does postulate a war, a great war, like a world war.
It's a total war.
Yeah, a total war, and they actually make the point. You've alluded to this point that now we're living with nuclear weapons. So if there is a total war, it will involve nuclear weapons. They make that forecast, which is a very frightening one.
Yes.
And we're just getting a lot of books coming out now that are forecasting a war between China and America. So a lot of political scientists I respect, that's not many, that's the minority of political scientists, they are predicting a war between China and America. Within this period, actually, within the 2030s, possibly this decade, the 2020s. So there is this, it's either a coincidence, you know, an accidental coincidence, or it fits long cycle theory. That would be, if the crisis is to end in a war, an international war rather than a civil war, then surely the likeliest form of international war would be China-US, or US-led West versus a China-led anti-Western coalition.
Yes, so China and Russia on one side, and the West on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, not everybody thinks that Russia would join China, so it might be rational for Russia to sit on the sidelines and watch the US and China weaken each other, and then Russia is left in a stronger position. But on the other hand, Russia's inclinations are more to China than the US.
But wars could take other forms. I mean, for example, it could be a new American Civil War.
Yeah.
I mean, Texas could secede, other states could join it, and yes, that would cause problems as well. It's impossible to say what the climax of the crisis will be.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I agree. So it's kind of impossible to say. They do give us some examples. So on pages 272 to 273, they talk about a fiscal crisis, which might be the 2008 crisis, global terrorism, which might be 2001, the 9/11 war on terror crisis. They've got an impasse over the federal budget, creating a stalemate. Well, that might be the sort of a political breakdown in the US between an evenly balanced Congress and a president who, you know, like Joe Biden, wants to spend a lot, but Congress refuses to allow any budget to pass as long as the president has that agenda. That might fit. Interestingly, there's a pandemic in here, which might fit 2020 COVID-19, global pandemic. In this scenario, page 273, they postulate this pandemic causing social disorder, which might fit the Black Lives Matter protests and Antifa, the Antifa hangers on to that. And then finally, they've got growing anarchy throughout the former Soviet republics, including Iran is mentioned in that. You know, you could, rather than an international war, we could have a lot of failed states. There's an awful lot of meat there to chew on.
Yeah, but I think there is one thing we can say about the war, that it has to resolve this problem that is causing society to split. Whatever the war is, it has to resolve that, because it always did before.
Yeah, it always did before, but it sort of often did in an indirect way. So if you think about the Second World War, the Second World War was not about American tensions. It was America taking sides in a largely European, Asian dispute between nationalism, fascism, communism. These were sort of external to America, but in fighting that war, the Second World War, it clarified what sort of America Americans wanted to be. So it indirectly resolved tensions within American society. So we don't have to have a civil war about wokeness. We just need a crisis that will clarify what sort of people we want to be, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, reading the book, they seem to suggest that at first, during the crisis, that there will appear to be many problems, and it's very complicated. You were alluding earlier to the difference between liberalism and communalism, and I was saying woke and based. Eventually, towards the climax of the crisis, all these problems will appear to coalesce into one big problem, and then the war will resolve that big problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think at risk of reaching too much into historical precedent to predict the future, if the next international war looks like the Second World War, let's say it's a clash between the US and China, that could stimulate some of the nationalism that America has lost and reminds people why it's good to be American, what is good about the founding, why it's good to be democratic, liberal. That war might indirectly clarify what sort of Americans wants to be. On the other hand, the civil war, such as it is, it could get conflated into that war. So we've already seen the woke side with China on everything. So the woke civil war inside the West, it already has this international dimension where the woke, because they're anti-Western, and they're also anti-white and other things, that they're natural, because they're binary, because they're too reductionist to realize that there's more than two sides to any story. You're either woke or you're not. And since China is not Western, China must be the good guys in this battle. We're already getting people, making apologies for China's human rights abuses at the same time as they're raging against America's alleged human rights abuses, America's racism, America's history of slavery, but not, we're not going to worry about slavery elsewhere. It's only in America that we were going to worry about it. So there's already this conflation of the culture wars inside the West, principally.
Well, I think the Chinese are definitely using wokeism to destabilize America. They said so at the recent meeting in Alaska. They accused the Americans of, having a binary society, unjust society, and whether they're deliberately encouraging wokeism as well is another question.
Yeah, interestingly, the Chinese as a whole. So I mean, the citizens of China and the Chinese diaspora, they tend to be very anti-woke at the same time as they are. Some of them are taking advantage of the woke narrative, the woke's anti-Western narrative. So it's convenient for the Chinese government to attack the West as internally corrupt and racist, and that any criticism of China is actually racist. It's not substantive. So it's convenient, but Asians as a whole, and I mean Asian Americans as well as Asians of Asia, they tend to be more anti-woke than white Westerners because they've seen the cost. Like the simple example is Asians being discriminated against in Western universities because Asians are overrepresented, and they're not of the fashionable non-white groups. So there are other non-white groups other than Asians that are getting more affirmative action, and Asians then they're suffering worst as a consequence of this. So they're sort of assumed to have the privileges, the non-white privileges of the new order, but in actual fact they're not. They're getting discriminated against the same as whites are. So there's a lot of self-interested reasons for Asians, meaning both Western Asians and Asians of Asia, to be anti-Western, and surveys show that the Chinese of China are extremely antagonistic to the woke. They have a word for it, Baijiu, white liberals. It's a derogatory comment. In English, white liberal doesn't sound particularly derogatory, but in Chinese, it's used in a very derogatory way. So,
Oh, I see. I didn't know that.
yeah,
They of course had a similar experience back in the, was it the 60s with the Cultural Revolution?
yeah,
They had
that's true too. Yeah, yeah. So China's had its own crisis in a separate generational cycle.
Yes.
Yeah,
but that's another interesting aspect, that with the Second World War, a lot of these nations synchronized according to the book. And another thing is that yes, Asians in America almost prove that the system is not racist, because they're doing extremely well in academia. That's why there have to be quotas in universities. So to me, that proves that America is not a racist society.
Right, and in fact, the woke have to invent white on Asian racism in order to make their reductionist view of the world fit. So now they have an invented view that Asians are the latest victims of white supremacists. In actual fact, Asians are not disproportionately targeted for violence in America. Asians do better by almost all measures than white Americans do in America. And so far as Asians are victims of violence, they're disproportionately targeted by non-whites. So, that's an aside, just to illustrate how the woke have to invent the intersectional imperative that everybody non-white is a victim, in order to deny that Asians are being victimized not by white supremacists, they're being victimized by woke university administrators.
Yes. Yes, well, the reason I was so excited by this model is that it shows that it presents our society almost as if it's a biological clock. Because for example, if you take a neutral society and you push it with an extreme event, such as happened in England at Bosworth Field in 1485, then what tends to happen is that will repeat. So people born just after the event won't know what war is like. And so when they become the leaders of the society 60 years later, they will instigate another one. And then it will go on through history as it seems to have done. So what interested me was the fact that this is the first opportunity to try and predict things quantitatively with maths. I'd quite like to write some equations for it if I can. See if I could predict some of the changes.
We should point out there are some odd anomalies in the cycle itself according to the book. So for instance, there's one seculum, which is their term for, well, it's a Latin term, so it's not their term, but they've adopted the Latin term for this cycle. There's one particular seculum in American history which lacks a turning around the American Civil War in the 19th century. One of the seculums goes 3 turnings instead of 4, which would mess up the mathematics. And I'm not sure we have a good justification for that.
I remember when I was very young, I read a book by Isaac Asimov called Foundation.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've read that one, but it reminds me very much of that. There was this chap in it called Harry Seldon who could predict the future societies, and he had the way he did it was at certain points of history, societies collapse into what he called crises, where only one way forward is possible, and that sounds very similar to this. And I always wanted to write some equations to do this, to be like Harry Seldon.
Yeah, I think I may be repeating a concern I had earlier, which is it's very difficult for me to think historically of periods as long as 20 years as distinct crises, because you have so many crises within a 20-year period. And probably in recent history, we've had more frequency of crises because we have a more population dense world and more interconnectivity and so forth. So we actually may have a more rapid manifestation of crises within that 20-year period. So it makes it's difficult for me to think of a 20-year crisis. Like which of the many crises in a 20-year period do we consider the crisis, or the beginning crisis, or the end crisis?
Having read, well, in the book, they argue that it's not the crises themselves, the events themselves that matter. It's the response to them. So in the 20 years of the so-called crisis, what happens is that you get prophets who like to boss people about. And then at the other end, the young men are all heroes who are very used to being told what to do. So this is why during a crisis, you get these major events happening, and small events can blow up because of this reason, because the prophets get all excited. They tell the young men to invade somewhere, and then it happens.
Yeah.
Whereas, when another constellation is present, so when nomads are in charge and artists are not inclined to take their orders, you don't get the same thing. For example, the Korean War didn't turn into anything big. Everybody complained about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think one of the difficulties reading this book is some of the terms are difficult for me to handle, at least. You know, so the terms for these generations, like the prophets, the heroes, and this is a problem with terminology rather than the book, but the terms oversimplify the complexity of the generation. So, for instance, the heroes, as you're indicating just there, the heroes are not necessarily heroes in a positive sense, as they go and fight evil. They can be manipulated by the prophets, and that, yes. You know, so you could get these woke prophets who send a naive generation to war for the wrong ideals. So we tend to think of heroes as positive, so they're the heroes that go out and save people and save the world. But heroes can be manipulated as soldiers of doom as well. And the book makes that very clear, but unfortunately, the terms themselves are loaded in a way that, it makes it difficult to describe the complexity and the empiricism of their theory with the terms they themselves use.
You could call them the dutiful instead of the heroes, right? Or the obeyers or something.
The obedient, obedient generation. Yeah, yeah. I think there's another part of their forecast which I just found. I knew it was there. I just found it. So this is in page. These pages aren't actually numbered, but they have a number of pages in the middle on summarizing the turnings over different generations. So this is the overview section on page 123. So it's an overview of history in terms of generations. This really should be an appendix, but they've put it towards the middle. And here they talk about the cultural wars as the third turning. And they've dated it 1984 to 2005. And then the current crisis we are now living in, they call the millennial crisis.
Yes.
Which has a dual meaning. It has a dual meaning because they refer to the millennial generation in the same way that we do, and the millennials are, as a generation, they are agents of this crisis. But it's also, the dual meaning is that it's also a crisis that begins in the noughties, in the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s.
Yeah, that's slightly unfortunate, yes.
Yeah, but later on they will talk about the crisis as having these overtones of the culture wars. So the culture wars, that they really date 1984, 2005. The culture wars are so strong that they define the crisis as well, which goes through to climax in around 2026.
Yes, but as I said, that's simply because of what they call the constellation of archetypes, the order in which these archetypes are living at that time.
But
there's quite nice.
That's the theoretical part, is that every seculum, you're going to have that particular constellation. When you have that constellation, you're going to have a crisis. So that's theoretically true for every seculum, but they are interpreting our current seculum given the history we're living through, and they're trying to make a forecast of what that crisis will look like. And I suppose much as I appreciate how predictive the book is that there will be a crisis, and their dating seems remarkably prescient, I'm still kind of disappointed that they don't specify the crisis particularly well, the type of crisis it will be, given that they are so historically grounded, particularly in the 20th century. Their knowledge of history, particularly cultural history, is so strong that I was hoping by the end of the book, I was wanting to get to that conclusion where they populate the theory with current events and help me forecast what the crisis will look like in our case.
Yes, I suppose there must be some way to do it, given the right sort of historical knowledge.
I think they had, earlier in the book, they suggest they do have that historical knowledge, because they got to this book having studied generations. So they wrote a book on the 13th generation, which is the nomads. They wrote books on the millennials, and those books were grounding the generations in history. They were saying the generations had their formative experiences at these times with these events. This is how popular culture interpreted these events. This is why the generation thinks the way it does. They're so historically grounded. I was hoping for more predictiveness from that historical richness. I know that's somewhat unfair because prediction is difficult. I realize that, but this book is a peculiarly rich marriage of theory and history, and it is so good at describing what happened and what is happening. But then when it comes to its forecasting, I found it sort of shies away from possibly what the authors what the authors were deducting, but were frightened to actually put in print.
Well, that's very interesting, because I think it may be possible that it's not possible for any one human to look at society and determine what the solution is going to be. And I think our society is a bit like a supercomputer, actually. It's got these two possibilities, woke and based. And the society as a whole, as a collective, is trying to decide which way to go. And the only way it can do that is to physicalize it. So the debate ends, the wars begin, and the winner is the winner, and that is the decision. So I see it in a very positive way, actually, although it's quite a painful process.
Yeah, and I suppose if I was to think about this logically, we're dealing with probabilistic theories, and as you've articulated, in the optimistic interpretation, which I try to share, probabilistically, the crisis ends well, and we restore things, we restore virtuous things. Now there is still a probability, there is still a possibility that it goes the other way. It's a probabilistic theory, it's not deterministic. So we can bet on the crisis resolving in the right way, but we can't guarantee it. You know, the
yes,
precedents alone strongly suggest the probabilistic outcome, but probabilities are not guarantees. I'm actually
another factor that they
go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, go on. Okay. Another factor they haven't considered is what happens when everybody becomes aware of this cycle and the fourth turning. Does it affect the fourth turning itself, if we're aware of it? Which goes back to Asimov's foundation as well.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, my inclination is that this is one of the reasons I'm motivated to discuss this book, is my inclination is that people need to understand the fourth turning to wake themselves up to the struggle we're engaged in. They need to realize the stakes of the struggle we're engaged in. If you're not going to fight this highly destructive Marxist woke, fight against this woke movement, you are playing with the decline of civilization. So if more people were aware of the fourth turning as a theory, they might be more motivated to stick up
Yes.
what's right here.
In a sense, now is the time. The great thing about knowing about the fourth turning is that we know that right now the decision is being made by this societal computer, however it's working. So every tiny step we make in these years, these particular years, will affect the next 80. It will determine the society we have till the end of the century, when the next crisis will occur. So it's important to get it right.
Yeah, and I think there's also a danger in this is true of history as a discipline. There's a danger in acquiescing in as a victim in history. Where historians tend to say, I don't predict anything, I only describe what happened, I don't draw conclusions. You know, what will happen, it just happens. You know, I think that's a very passive view of society. We are agents of change. There are things worth fighting for, and there are things worth standing against. And I think it's very clear in this book, to me, it's you can disagree with me if you like, but it's clear to me which side these authors are on. They are conservative with a small c. Their bias is to preserve rather than to tear down, and I think that's our bias too. But it's not a bias that is prejudicial. It's a bias based on study. We know our bias is based on what we know to be right. Historically grounded and politically, philosophically grounded. I think, you know, that historians in general, but particularly the new woke version of history as it's taught in universities now, it's linear and it's deterministic in a progressive sense. All you have to do is you just have to hang on to history. It's going to produce you to utopia, and you can hurry it along by being woke. Which is a very destructive way to think. And then even if you're not persuaded of that particular view, you're left with a passive, the secondary position is passive, which is just history just happens and there's nothing you can do about it, and you just have to accept what happens, which I think is irresponsible and somewhat cowardly too.
Yes, I think if America does choose the woke path, then it will ultimately fail. because it's almost an antithesis to what America was founded, the principles America was founded on in the first place, and B, I used to be, well, I still am in some ways a socialist in that I like the welfare state and the NHS, but I don't think communism works. I mean, in Russia it failed because people were not motivated. It was seen rightly as unjust. If you work hard, you should get the benefit from it. And that's the American way, and it's what's driven America to the position it's in. And if we lose that, then other nations will dominate.
Right. Right. I mean, I think that gets us to a good way to summarize what the fight is really about, because it's a fight for America as founded, which is classically liberal. It's about individual autonomy. It's about checks and balances. The woke want to refashion America as authoritarian, putting group interests ahead of individual choice, and they're destroying a lot of the checks and balances in order to centralize more power, in order to exercise this power towards woke objectives like defunding the police, taking more federal control over state elections, so taking power away from the states to centralizing it to federal government, taking power away from democratically elected parts of government towards the administrative state, so the unaccountable part of the state that regulates lives without democratic accountability. The founders of the American Republic carefully crafted the Constitution with all those protections for individual liberties and all those checks and balances because they were classical liberals. And there is no progressive version of that which retains America as constituted. That's not going to be the America. It's going to be a different America. It's not going to be America as constituted.
I think people have to understand that communism is always very attractive when you look at it the first time, because if you're poor or you're disadvantaged somehow, it's a way up. It's a step up. So there's great hope in it, but unfortunately, it doesn't work on a society. It doesn't work it doesn't motivate people, and it's unjust. And I think Lincoln had the right idea in his Gettysburg Address. He said that people should be assumed to be born equal, which I think is right. I think we should all be born equal, no matter what race we are. But after that, it's up to us. We're then judged by what actions we do after we're born.
Yeah. So equality of opportunity, not equity of outcome.
Yes.
Objective.
And that's what America's all about, I think.
Yeah, and we should say, I mean, this book is very American founded. It's what America is about, but also the West is about. It's what the West used to be about, because the West is classically liberal, and we've forgotten that as classical liberalism has dropped out in favor of what progressives call liberalism, which is not classical liberalism. It's more of a state-powered liberalism, so empowering the individual from state by state actions, rather than the individual empowering themselves within the freedoms guaranteed by the state. Yeah.
So yeah, one interesting point is that the UK and the US are very good experimental examples of this sort of cycle in action, because first the UK and then the US later were very isolated. The UK is an island, so you can see these rhythms very well, and then the US is a bit like an island as well, because there are no dominant states next to it. So that was a very interesting point for me. Being a physicist, I like to isolate systems and look at how they work. Another point I thought was interesting was highs are very good for literature. A lot of the great literature is written in the highs after the crises, simply, I suppose, because they have more to talk about. They have great deeds to talk about.
Yeah, and also I think also highs are liberal in the right sense. So there is room for a lot of artistic creativity because naturally the young generation particularly wants to create as an overcompensation for the destruction of the crisis they've just come out of, and then you're going to get a lot of artistic expression as an overcompensation, but also the crisis itself needs to be understood. So there's this natural imperative to explore the crisis that is so recent through art.
Yeah, what's happened?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a good point that we're living in a very uncreative period, an uncreative period, because of the attacks on free speech, the cancellations, the limitations of what is acceptable or not. Our artistic landscape is very boring. I mean, there's
yes, films are a good example. Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
modern films
about racism is bad. Television dramas, racism is bad. Sexism is bad. There's pretty much no allowance for any other content.
Yes, and that in itself is quite dangerous because people start desperately seeking for whatever they can to get away from this particular idea. I mean, an idea can be good, but if you get it for every day for 20 years, it's it can get a bit monotonous.
Yeah, right. So there's the irony or the perversity that the quest to constrain what is allowable sparks a new backlash, which polarizes society into the crisis that we are probably living.
No human likes to be told what to do. So if you force them to think a certain way, almost all of them eventually are going to think the opposite way.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to what other people call oscillations, that human psychology is a series of overcompensations. So you do something vicious, you overcompensate by being very virtuous. In politics, we vote for somebody left-wing. After a while, we see the vices of the left-wing pathology, so we vote right-wing, and then we get the vices of the right-wing, and we oscillate back to left-wing. So there are these oscillations in individual behavior and social behavior that don't allow us to ever settle at the sweet spot. And moreover, we're living through unique events, which mean that it's difficult to navigate that sweet spot anyway. So we live these oscillations, and one implication of that is that polarization is normal. This is one of the things that the woke, it's one of the facts that the woke like to deny. They seem to think that there's a possibility that everybody's equitable, everybody's in harmony, there are no prejudices, there's no polarization, we must be harmonious. Anybody who disagrees is on the fringe, they're extremist, and they must be exiled or forced to come back to the center. The center is not normal. We pass through the center in our oscillations, but most of the time we're oscillating on one side of it or the other. So the oscillations are normal, the center is not normal. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, exactly. It's the shower effect as well. You can never get it quite right. You turn it up, you turn it down.
Yeah.
There's a delay, which causes an oscillation.
I think another metaphor which you should appreciate in particular is waves. You mentioned waves earlier, right? You've studied waves as a physical phenomenon. Yeah. Oscillations sort of overlap this theory of waves. So waves come and go. That the impetus for something builds up. You get a very strong wave. The impetus suddenly becomes strong enough to change, and then you have ripple effects in other areas, and then you might have a rebound. And we could maybe overextend that metaphor, but what do you think about it as the utility of that metaphor waves in history.
Yes, well, I said earlier that I think Anglo-Saxon United States is basically a wave that started on Bosworth Field. I think that's what this book is saying, with a period of 80 years, and that's very interesting to me. It's interesting that the earlier periods were longer. So the first 4 cyclum, I believe, were about 100 years, and the last 2 have been about 80, according to the book. So has something caused them to speed up? What that would be, I don't know, but there are several possibilities. In a sense, you would expect them to slow down because people are living longer.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, it's sort of counterintuitive that the ancient seculums were periodized longer than our current ones. So the ancients talked about 100-year cycles, even though they supposedly had a shorter life expectancy. Although, as you know, life expectancy is a kind of misleading metric, because some people live very long lives, but average life expectancy is corrupted by it's skewed. It's skewed by high death rates in childhood. And so life expectancy can be a misleading measure. You really have modes. Some people have very short lives, that's one mode, and then other people have very long lives, that's another mode. And then it may be in the past, in the ancient world, that the people who had the long lives, that mode was so powerful in defining the seculum as a whole. So that it's the few people who had very long lives, those are the people who had a lot of power to define how the seculum went. That's not in the book.
Yes, that might...
Well, it sort of is in the book, but I'm sort of reading more into it than is in the book.
Yes, that does make sense. So in more modern times, the people who rule are more democratic. So there are a wider representation of the population. And so their average lifespan will be 80 or whatever it is in the West now. That does make sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, even though our life expectancy is longer, it's only longer with ill health. So your life expectancy of powerful life hasn't changed in a sense. So the life span in which you have the energy and the competency to actually get things done is the same, even though you're living longer, because those extra 10 years or 20 years that modern societies have, those extra years are with a lot of ill health. They're not particularly productive years.
Yes, it could be. There was a nice quote from the book I wanted to read that kind of summarizes the archetypes. So that the prophet born in the high seeks vision.
What page?
The nomad born in the... Sorry?
What page are you on, Mike?
Oh, I don't know which... I should have noted the page, actually, but this is from my notes. It's right near the end.
Yeah. Doesn't matter. Sorry, go ahead.
So the prophet seeks vision. The nomad who is born in the awakening, so that would represent us, seeks realism. And I quite like this quote because I think in physics, I'm kind of seeking realism instead of idealism.
Yeah.
Like the generation before me did. The hero born in the unraveling seeks power. And the artist born in the crisis seeks empathy.
Yeah, well, I suppose if for the next generation, the artist generation, if they do not have, if the crisis doesn't come out the right way, there will be no empathy, because the woke will not judge people by the character of their, but by their character. They will judge them by race and gender and other immutable identifiers. So the
things that we can't control.
Yeah, so the artist won't get much empathy. The woke don't have empathy. They have a lot of inflexible categorizations which are not empathetic.
Yes, they're only empathetic to particular people.
Yeah,
they see as victims.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's real empathy. I mean, a lot of it is very exploitative. So the fashionable identities are being exploited for the political power of the exploiters. So it's often said that American blacks are being exploited by the Democratic Party to keep the Democratic Party in power. But that doesn't necessarily mean that American blacks are better off.
It's rather like the workers in the early Soviet Union. They were exploited by the communists to gain power.
Yeah, that was the
thing. It's like
irony of communism, is that we're going to privilege the working class, but wait a minute, we're going to create a new elite that rules over the working class.
Yeah.
The great unraveling.
What did you think about the idea of the great grey champion who appears?
I can't say I really understood that. I can't say I really understood that. I could see when they made historical examples of grey champions, I could see, yeah, okay, that worked in history, but as a theoretical concept, I actually didn't follow it theoretically.
It sounds very mystical to me.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know who the grey champion of our era.
No, which is worrying, because if you need a grey champion, we don't have one, which suggests that this crisis is going to go the wrong way.
Or maybe they just haven't appeared yet.
Well, they're leaving it a bit late.
Well, it's not quite time yet. I think if the crisis began in 2008, it'll be resolved by 2030, something like that. So the climax should be around about 2025.
Yeah, I think you're being optimistic there. Again, I think, yeah, you're more optimistic than me. I think, I mean, even if we date this 2008, we're quite late in the seculum. They date it from 2005, so they're talking about a climax in 2026. But if we take the start of it as the economic crisis 2008, we're pushing the crisis later and later. And we could date the crisis from 2020 because of the pandemic and the racial political protests, in which case the crisis won't be resolved until 2040. So it just gets pushed later and later.
But remember, I said that I dated 2008 using fertility rates. Because in the book, they say the crisis is always marked at the beginning by a sudden drop in the fertility rate, the birth rate. And that happened in 2008 because of the financial crash. So I do like to date it from 2008.
Yeah, I accept that. That is another factor, but warnings about declining fertility were aired in the 1990s. It's been a problem. You know, it was known then as the graying population that the solution there was a progressive solution, which was immigration. So progressives said in the 1990s, we need to open our borders and be more transnational, have more immigration to replace the workers that are dying out without the children. We're not producing enough children to replace our retirees and those are the generation that is dying out. So there was the worry about the graying of America, the graying of Europe, and immigration was the solution.
That should be reversed in the first turning. The prediction is that the birth rate will go way up because traditional family will return. So the men will do the work and the women will raise the kids. And that happened before. It's very interesting if you look at films, and I've been doing this ever since reading this book. I've watched films from the late 1930s and then from sort of 1948 onwards. And the depiction of women in the films is very interesting because before the war, they were obviously trying to encourage women to work. I think there's a film, My Girl Friday, all about a female journalist. And then after the war, they were encouraging women to stay at home and raise kids.
Yeah, and that was true after the First World War too, the same dynamic.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, and probably that's true of any war. The unprecedented facility for immigration in recent decades may have messed up the seculum because it may have messed up the incentive to replace the birth rate after a crisis. Because as progressives said in the 1990s, progressives did not say, women, you need to stay home and have more children. They said, we're just going to have more immigration. So that, and immigration is more possible now than it ever has been in the past because of the greater ease of communications. So it's easier for people to travel.
But in the book, it says that unravelings are always associated with mass immigration. The unraveling is always associated with that. And that ends during the crisis because people become far more nationalistic and protective.
Yeah, that's a good point. Again, that's another strike against the book for the woke elite, and it's another strike why they're going to say this is another reason why I shouldn't read the book because they seem to be advocating for a secular that ends more nationalistically, more traditionally, right? Traditional families, national security, more national control of borders, less immigration, a restoration of.
Way to sell.
Sorry.
That's the best way to sell. That's the best way to sell it. If you ban it or cancel it, people start to wonder what's in there, so they'll read it.
Yeah, I suppose so, but I think it's shadow cancelled in the sense that there's no reason for anybody to know about this book because it's not on the reading lists. It's not as if it's being read and the woke are saying we must ban this from libraries. It's just people are just not aware of it. They're being taught other versions of history, 1619 project. They're not being taught long cycle theories of history.
Okay, well that might be a good thing because it might mean that the cyclum continues as before. If everybody was aware of what's going on, it would change the model. It would change the behavior.
You're always the optimist. Whatever interpretation I have, you've got an optimistic version of it.
Right. Okay. Possibly.
See, I'm more inclined to intervention. So you're saying let's have less awareness because it makes the seculum proceed in a more naturalistic way, like as it has proceeded in its previous 6 cycles, with a resolution which is sort of positive, with a positive bias. Whereas I'm saying we need to intervene, we need to make people aware of this book so that they can fight on the right side of this crisis and make sure that it comes out in a positive sense.
Well, I think both approaches have merit. They can't both be applied, but there's an argument for both. I have confidence. I've got this idea that our civilization is a kind of biological computer, and that this is simply the way it decides on a question, and that it will decide the right way. Now, of course, I might be wrong about that, but I can't see a society based on wokeness ever succeeding. I think it would collapse very quickly, like Soviet Russia did.
Well, yeah, but hang on. I mean, I hate to keep disagreeing with you, Mike, but the Soviet Union didn't collapse that quickly. I mean, for an awful lot of people, hundreds of millions of people, they had, they had a good 5 decades of authoritarian, brutal repression. It was that's the larger part of a seculum.
Yeah, so could that be in store for the United States then?
Right.
A long, slow decline.
Yeah, I mean, if the woke remake their institutions in a powerful, once in a generation sense, they get the chance to make changes that only happen as powerfully as this once every 80 years, then surely they institutionalize their version of America in a way that lasts for decades, and possibly it lasts for another 80 years until you get another crisis to tear it all down. Again,
well, I believe if that did happen,
for you.
I think sometimes it pays to be optimistic.
Well, it pays to be optimistic in the sense, at least in the sense that it's much easier psychologically to live optimistic than pessimistic. That's certainly true.
Yes, but I mean, looking at history, we've had 6 of these cyclums so far, and every one of them has had a crisis in which a question has been asked of the population, and the population has chosen in a correct way from our point of view.
Yeah, still, that's,
so I suppose,
still an N of 6, isn't it, Mike? I mean, the N is 6. That's not a great, that's not a large
no,
population.
it's not. But it's all we have to go on.
Yeah,
and you can look at Roman history. You can look at Roman history as well. I mean, they had, I think it was 12 cyclums before they collapsed.
that's true. Yeah, and frankly, I would have hoped for 12 cycles out of America. So America was so well constituted. We might have hoped for America to have lasted as long as the Roman Republic.
To me, America does not look like a country about to implode. Only,
I suppose you're remote to it compared to me. I'm living through it, and it's a lot more alarming to live through it than to watch the news about it remotely. I mean, we're seeing institutions unraveling now. Institutions are being remade now. That that speaks to how advanced the crisis seems. It's almost like the woke have already won. It's almost like we're not fighting in the crisis anymore. The crisis has been won for the woke, and they're remaking the institutions, including the Defense Department, the CIA, the FBI, which have become very partisan, and they're explicitly recruiting in unmeritorious woke ways, and their investigatory powers are being applied in very partisan ways. The federal government has no interest in securing the borders. It's on the side of the rioters. It's speaking the rhetoric, the anti-police rhetoric. It's speaking the Marxist rhetoric. These are the people in charge. They have won. It's easy to make that to take that impression from what you're seeing. The woke are in charge. They're in the White House. They have a majority in Congress. They're remaking America already in a Marxist / woke way.
Well, there hasn't been a conflict yet. So I don't think we can, I don't think it's the end of the game.
Well, maybe
that way. Judging by,
sorry, Mike.
Judging by this book, what's going to happen is that the based part of the population is going to take physical action. So secede from the Union, something like that. Every example in history points to that some response will come. I mean, it's very difficult to say, isn't it? I don't want to say it, but that's what this book is saying, that there has to be some sort of physical conflict.
Yeah, I suppose the cost of what you're saying that the resolution has to come. The implication of that is that the longer it takes to come, the uglier the conflict has to be, that the resolution of the conflict has to be, right? Because if
yes,
the earlier we nip this in the bud, the earlier we nip this in the bud, the more peaceful the resolution can be. The longer it goes, the more entrenched the two sides become. I don't want to say bloodier, because I'm not convinced that the fight has to be bloody in a physical sense. But however costly this fight has to be, it's just going to get costlier. The longer we wait to resolve this, the costlier.
It's already getting worse. The debate is already over, because we can't really debate online anymore because we're being cancelled.
You mean peaceful debate is over, so we're not left with any other form of fight apart from something more physical, like a
yes, it has to be more physical. Yes. So obviously, I don't want to suggest war or anything like that, because it's a horrific thing. But at least some sort of secession of states. Texas might secede, others might follow.
Yeah.
So some action has to be taken.
Yeah. I mean, you could say that we're already in a civil war. I mean, there was fighting in the streets in 2020, in America and in Britain as well. And it was the institutions like the British police sided with the rioters.
Yes.
American police tended to be the victims. They were losing that war in a lot of cities. Portland, Oregon is a good example. In Los Angeles, San Francisco, West Coast cities are still pretty lawless at their centers, and they're certainly even if you dispute the term lawless, you can't dispute that violent crime is many times higher now than it was 2 years ago. Emigration is higher from these cities. These are not happy cities, even though they tend to be woke. They tend to be run by very woke governments that claim that they're living in utopias where illegal immigrants can find sanctuary, and the homeless can be prioritized over the tourists, and we can impose green mandates at the expense of business, and we can practice affirmative action in favor of privileged groups, to explicitly to overcome past alleged racism, the overturning of merit. Again, it speaks to two points in my pessimistic vision of this, is that the war is already being fought. America is much more violent, has become much more violent, politically violent in the last couple of years.
It's only been fought by one side, though, from what I see.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I mean, there are two sides, but I take your point that one side is not as mobilized as the other. I mean, one side has been enabled. It's been enabled by social media companies and the big corporations that make millions of dollars of donations to Black Lives Matter and bail out Antifa rioters from jail and create legal defense funds for the rioters, the criminals, the violent criminals who should not be the ones defended. And then they're condemning police. They're inventing reasons to cancel academics, police, politicians. You know, again, in my pessimistic view, this is the civil war is already upon us, and we're already losing it.
There doesn't seem to be any significant pushback at the moment.
Correct.
So I think in order to do it peacefully, you have to have something like Texas threatening to secede or something like that.
Yeah. And that's a possibility. I mean, it's certainly the way governors of places like Texas, so Texas, South Dakota, Indiana, Kentucky, Arizona, these states are extremely antagonistic to the federal government. They're involved in lawsuits. Like, for instance, Texas sues the federal government to try to force the federal government to secure the border because Texas is having to do it for itself. These are the sorts of disputes that have ramifications of the era before the Civil War, where states and federal government were in dispute to the extent that eventually states seceded. So I entertain your scenario. I think it's a lot likelier than people are used to thinking. I'm not saying it's likely, but
that's a peaceful way to do it, you see, because the central part of the country could secede, and then Washington might realize that, you know, some Americans do not agree with this proposal, and it might be all right.
Right. And they might secede, not in the full sense of seceding from the Union. It's a full separation from the Union, but they could secede in the sense that they cease to honor more and more federal states, such as
that'd be a good way to do it. Yes.
Yeah, like such as illegal immigration. So states like Texas are becoming enforcers of border control, which is not their mandate. The federal government reserves that power, responsibility, reserves that responsibility for itself. But other states are doing that. So they could see more examples of states taking on responsibilities for themselves and eschewing federal powers, saying we're not going to recognize federal authority on this issue any longer. And that might be sufficient to force the federal government to step back, return rights to the states, roll back the centralization of federal power, and temper down some of its woke objectives. So it returns to the traditional things that federal government did, which is national security and foreign policy.
Yes, I mean, I should say that in saying things like that, I don't want America to split up.
I know.
And it's not my place as a foreigner anyway to say that, but neither do I want America to vanish in its principle.
That's right.
I want it to
right.
remain...
Another way of saying that is it is better that some states secede to keep America alive than it is for America to die altogether. Yeah.
Because America is an idea, really. So, and that's being destroyed by this revolution.
Yeah. And the way you phrase that in a very American way. So you're humble enough to say you don't want to appear to intervene as a foreigner, but your instincts sound very American, and clearly Americans who see themselves as patriotic would entirely agree with you. I mean, we should note too that there's another way in which Americans might appear to secede, and that is by migration between the states. So America,
that is happening.
Yeah, it's happening. Right? Yeah, I mean, progressives deny that it's happening. They pretend that this is a right-wing myth, that no, utopia is in the blue states, and that everybody's happy there, and everybody wants to move there because they want the welfare, and they want the freedoms, right, of living in a progressive state. But the fact is that more people are leaving those states than are entering them. And the people who are immigrating into the progressive states, they tend to be very, very wealthy people who are retiring for sunshine and high public services, like such as free healthcare. They're not doing so because they like the business environment or the security, and they're rich enough to have private security, so they don't worry so much about the collapsing public security.
Okay, but the balance of flow is out of those states, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I'm saying progressives like to pretend that that's a right-wing myth, but empirically it's true. It's net emigration from blue to red, and that empowers red states. So red state governors are inviting people, come, leave California, come to my state because we have law enforcement, and we'll protect your families, and we'll give you a decent education without all the critical race theory. So come to our states, and that empowers states because then they have more taxation. They have a sort of democratic legitimacy in the sense that we are states where people want to live. So we have more democratic legitimacy to say this is what America should be. Yeah, so that might be another peaceful way of resolving this tension. Right, Mike, so final thoughts.
So I would definitely encourage people to read this book. I think it's amazing, and it explains very well where we are in the present time, recent events. And in reading it, I think it seems to suggest that society is a kind of decision-making machine, and it makes its decision once every 80 years in a crisis, and that's what's happening now. So if you want to speak up to influence that decision, now would be the time to do it.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you for introducing me to the book, or encouraging me to read it fully. And thank you for discussing it with me.
Well, thanks for inviting me.